Ryland Grace wakes up in space, and he slowly regains his memory that the sun is dying.
If we do nothing, everything on this planet will.
I'm a teacher at Grover Cleveland Middle.
You have a doctorate in molecular biology.
To save the world.
It's what you Americans would call a long shot.
There's so many incredible layers to this film. And then make friends with an alien.
Which was a concern for a little while.
He's a genius engineer. His planet's dying too. Their friendship is the heart of the movie.
One of the things that inspired us to make this to be a regular person who seek mankind.
I'm not an astronaut. I've never done a space. I can't even.
And having him on set really created some sort of magic.
The concept of a Hail Mary is a last ditch if you can do anything.
There are infinite possibilities for this to go wrong.
But also, it's full of so much warmth and humanity.
It's the movie. It's so epic. It's about how we don't give up hope.
It is time go.
Think you mean...
Project Hail Mary 2026 is more than just a space movie. It's an emotional sci-fi adventure you won't want to miss. In this video, Family Review Hub breaks down the movie, reviews the story, and reveals the fascinating facts behind it. Is it worth watching? Stay tuned and find out only on Family Review Hub. Project Hail Mary is a 2026 science fiction movie produced and directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, with the screenplay written by Drew Goddard. The movie is based on the 2021 novel by Andy Weir. It stars Ryan Gosling, who also helped produce the film. Sandra Hüller, James Ortiz, and Lionel Boyce also appear in supporting roles. The story follows Ryland Grace, played by Gosling, a middle school teacher who suddenly wakes up aboard a spaceship traveling through deep space. The crazy part? He has absolutely no memory of how he got there or why he's even on the mission. Work on the movie actually started way back in 2020. Even before Andy Weir's novel was officially published, Drew Goddard came back to write the screenplay after previously working on the movie adaptation of Weir's earlier book, The Martian, which was released in 2015. Filming for Project Hail Mary took place throughout 2024 in the United Kingdom, using both real locations and specially built movie sets. One of the coolest behind-the-scenes details is that all the scenes taking place inside the spaceship, the Hail Mary, were filmed on a real practical set that was specially built for the movie. So instead of relying completely on CGI, the actors actually had a real set to work with while filming those space scenes. Project Hail Mary had its big premiere in London on March 9, 2026. The movie was then released in the United States by Amazon MGM Studios on March 20, while Sony Pictures Releasing International handled the movie's release in other countries. The film received almost universal praise from critics and audiences, with a lot of love going toward Phil Lord and Christopher Miller's direction, Ryan Gosling's performance, the character of Rocky, and the movie's humor, emotional themes, and awesome visuals. Many critics even called it one of the best movies of 2026. On top of all that, the film was a huge hit at the box office, making around 684.2 million worldwide and becoming the fifth highest grossing movie of 2026. Ryland Grace, played by Ryan Gosling, wakes up from an induced coma aboard a spaceship called the Hail Mary. At first, a robot tries to help him understand where he is, but Grace completely freaks out. He panics, falls off the table, and awkwardly scoots out of the room. He's totally confused and dealing with retrograde amnesia, which means he can't remember important parts of his past. He starts searching the ship, hoping to find other people or at least some clue about where he is. But then he discovers something terrifying. The other two crew members are still inside their sleeping pods, but they're dead. Grace makes his way toward the upper levels of the ship and suddenly realizes the unbelievable truth. He's floating somewhere in outer space. The ship tells him that he's the only person on the entire crew manifest who is still alive. Even worse, sending a message back to Earth would take 11 years, 10 months, and 4 days. Grace slowly realizes that he's the only survivor of a 3-person mission heading toward the Tau Ceti star system, which is located 11.9 light years away from Earth. Grace starts getting flashbacks about his past, including the Arclight telescope's journey to study something called the Petrova line. This strange phenomenon stretches from the sun toward Venus. In his memories, Grace is back in his old life as a middle school science teacher. He's showing his students how sound waves work when they suddenly start asking him about the weird space dots that seem to be eating the sun. Grace tries to brush off the question and tells them that's something they should ask their parents about. But while playing a silly classroom game called The Ball is Lava, his students trick him into answering anyway. Grace explains that the strange dots could actually be blocking some of the sun's energy. If that continues, Earth's temperature could drop by 10 to 15 degrees over the next 30 years. The classroom instantly goes into panic mode, but Grace tries to calm everyone down by saying that the smartest scientists in the world are already working on the problem. Back on the Hail Mary, Grace decides to clean himself up. He shaves off his beard and starts searching the ship for food and supplies. He finds saline bags filled with vodka and several packs of ramen noodles, which honestly isn't the worst emergency food stash. He also starts looking through the personal belongings of the other crew members. By doing this, he slowly begins putting together pieces of their identities, their mission, and even parts of his own forgotten past. In another flashback, Grace is sitting in his classroom when Eva Stratt, played by Sandra Hüller, shows up. Stratt is part of the Petrova task force and she wants Grace's help because of a scientific paper he wrote. In the paper, Grace argued the scientists might be completely wrong about what life needs in order to exist. Because Grace refused to change his position, many people in his field wanted nothing to do with him. But Stratt isn't interested in his reputation. She follows him into the parking lot as he tries to leave and explains why she needs him. Grace's paper suggested that alien life on another planet might be able to evolve without needing water. Stratt asked him to join her and Carl, played by Lionel Boyce, to figure out exactly what the strange Petrova line samples are made of. Grace argues that there are plenty of other scientists who are more qualified than him. But Stratt points out something very strange. The life form around the sun isn't melting. And if it's not melting, she says, then it doesn't sound like it's made of water. Grace is taken to a secret laboratory and placed inside an isolated room where he can safely study the mysterious samples. He starts wondering if he was chosen for the mission because he's basically considered expendable. However, Stratt and the other scientists make it clear that they would definitely prefer it if he didn't die. Grace carefully examines these strange moving samples and notices that normal light doesn't seem to affect them. He injects one of the samples with a needle and suddenly gets super excited. He realizes that he's looking at a tiny living alien cell. Unfortunately, the little organism dies shortly afterward. Grace is pretty disappointed, but then he discovers something surprising. The organism is made almost entirely out of water. Later, Stratt meets Grace outside the laboratory. Grace explains that the organisms are producing a huge amount of infrared energy and he can't figure out exactly why. The infrared radiation is coming out at the same wavelength as the Petrova line. Grace develops a theory that these organisms are feeding on the sun's energy and then releasing that energy in order to move through space. But there's still one big mystery. Why are they specifically traveling toward Venus? Strat thanks him for his work and then basically dismisses him, but Grace isn't ready to walk away. He follows her and argues that he should be part of the project. Strat eventually gives him 3 more samples to study, along with the one he accidentally killed. Back aboard the Hail Mary, Grace starts examining several strange etchings on the walls of the ship. Another flashback takes him back to the time when he and Carl were trying to figure out why these organisms were traveling toward Venus instead of heading toward a closer planet. Carl comes up with an idea that eventually becomes known as the Carl hypothesis. His theory is that the organisms are being attracted to something very specific about Venus's environment. To test the idea, Grace and Carl use Carl's expense account to buy cardboard, aluminum foil, and duct tape. They build a simple experiment to test their theory. During the process, they temporarily lose track of the astrophage samples. They eventually place the box in complete darkness to keep the organisms safe. Then Grace makes an unbelievable discovery: the organisms have reproduced. That means he and Carl are now officially the fathers of a whole new generation of astrophage. Soon after that, a fighter jet takes Grace to a boat where Strat is waiting for him. She brings him into a huge conference room packed with scientists from all over the world. These scientists have repeated Grace's experiments using much more advanced and careful methods, and they've confirmed that his findings are real. Strat then gives Grace top secret clearance and officially brings him into Project Hail Mary. Strat explains the full situation to Grace. Almost every nearby star has been infected by the mysterious organism, which scientists have now named astrophage. The only exception is Tau Ceti, and nobody knows why. An international team is building a spaceship that will travel 11.9 light years to Tau Ceti to investigate what's happening. The ship will use astrophage as its fuel, but there's one major problem. It won't have enough fuel to make the trip back home. That means whoever goes on the mission will most likely die in deep space. Their discoveries and research will have to be sent back to Earth using a separate probe, and things are getting seriously dangerous. If the scientists can't find a solution, the world's countries could eventually turn against each other as the crisis gets worse. The astronauts will spend most of the extremely long journey in an induced coma to save resources and protect their bodies. The mission needs 3 highly skilled specialists: a pilot, an engineer, and a scientist. Back aboard the Hail Mary, Grace finally has to deal with the loss of his fellow crew members. He carries the bodies of Captain Yao Lijie, played by Ken Leung, and engineer Olesia Ilyukhina, played by Milana Weintraub, toward the airlock. Before sending them into space, Grace gives each of them a personal eulogy based on the belongings he found while searching the ship. He then releases their bodies into the darkness of space. After that, Grace sits inside a simulation room and prepares himself for what he thinks will be a massive impact. The ship starts a countdown and Grace braces for the worst. But instead of crashing or exploding, the ship simply shuts down after reaching orbit around Tau Ceti. Grace looks outside and notices that Tau Ceti also has a Petrova line, but unlike the sun, this star isn't getting dimmer. Then Grace detects another spaceship crossing the Petrova line. The Hail Mary identifies the mysterious object as Blip A. Grace tries to fly away from it, but the alien ship follows him. Suddenly, a mechanism releases another object, which is labeled Blip B. Grace thinks it could be some kind of bomb and quickly tries to avoid it, but instead of exploding, the object simply makes a little ding as it bounces off the Hail Mary's hull. Then comes Blip C. This object moves much slower than the others, giving Grace enough time to leave the ship and perform a spacewalk. He manages to retrieve it and brings it back inside for examination. What Grace discovers next completely blows his mind. The object is made of solid xenon, a substance that normally exists as a gas. Now Grace has even more questions about who built the mysterious ship, what these strange objects really are, and what exactly is waiting for him out there in the darkness of space. In a flashback, Strat works with a scientist to figure out how to create artificial gravity inside the Hail Mary. They use a centrifuge to simulate gravity, which allows tools and equipment to work properly in the zero-gravity environment of space. Back in the present, the Hail Mary finally enters a state where gravity is working, while Blip A watches Grace through a scope. Grace starts to realize that the aliens might have completely different ideas about how things work compared to humans. So when he opens Blip C, he uses the opposite of the usual righty-loosey, lefty-tighty rule. Inside, Grace discovers a 3D model of an entire star system. One star, 40 Eridani, is highlighted, which appears to show where the aliens came from. Grace then adds another piece to the model and labels it Earth, showing the aliens where he is from. Blip D contains another model that shows Blip A connected to the Hail Mary. Suddenly, a tunnel extends from Blip A and connects directly to Grace's ship. This allows Grace to leave the Hail Mary and spacewalk toward the alien ship's window. But when he gets there, he's completely shocked by what he sees, a strange creature that looks like it's made out of rocks. The creature taps on the window and then shows Grace a 3D model of himself, followed by a model of the Hail Mary. The alien is basically acting out a story showing Grace returning to his own ship. Once Grace understands the message and gets safely back aboard the Hail Mary, the tunnel disconnects. A little later, the tunnel connects again, but this time it's filled with air and has artificial gravity. Grace sets up cameras and lights so he can record everything. He knocks on the window and holds up a small model of Blip A made out of ramen noodles. After a tense wait, the strange creature comes back to the window. At first, things are pretty awkward. Both Grace and the alien misunderstand each other's movements and think the other one might be trying to attack. But then the creature starts copying Grace's movements. It imitates his dances, poses, and other gestures to show that it isn't dangerous. Grace notices something very strange. The alien doesn't appear to have a face at all. Grace tries to start what looks like a simple tapping game with the creature, but the alien eventually gets frustrated and tries to explain that it's actually pointing toward a separate gift instead of trying to play a tapping game. Grace doesn't understand at first. He also can't figure out why the alien keeps wanting him to take off his helmet. Then Grace finally notices something important. He sees two groups of 8 objects, which he realizes represent oxygen. Grace removes his helmet and discovers that he can actually breathe inside the connecting tunnel without wearing his spacesuit. At the same time, the two spaceships begin rotating together, creating a stable environment for both of them. Back aboard the Hail Mary, Grace starts examining the gifts the alien gave him. He realizes that both humans and aliens are facing the exact same problem, a mysterious astrophage infection that is slowly destroying their home stars. To help them communicate, Grace decides to use mathematics as a universal language. He also gives the alien a name. Because the creature looks like a walking rock, Grace decides to call him Rocky. Rocky starts playing around with a ruler, but he clearly has no idea what the object is supposed to do. He wraps it around himself instead of using it as a measuring tool. Grace also shows him a clock, but Rocky doesn't seem very interested. Grace eventually figures out why. Rocky's species doesn't see the world through light the way humans do. Instead, they sense the surfaces around them. Because Rocky can only detect the outline of the clock, Grace adds pieces of tape to the face so Rocky can understand the numbers through echolocation. Rocky reacts happily when he finally understands what the clock is. Grace then tries to show Rocky a thumbs up as a sign of approval. But Rocky insists on using thumbs down instead. So the two make a deal. Between them, a thumbs down will mean something positive. Rocky then shows Grace what an Iridian clock looks like, giving Grace a better understanding of how his alien friend's world works. Grace creates special software to translate Rocky's musical language into English. As they slowly improve their communication, Grace also starts recording video journals about Rocky so the team back on Earth can learn about the alien. Rocky explains that he's a mechanical engineer. He works with a strange solid form of xenon, which Grace decides to call xenonite. Rocky also reveals that his own star is dying just like Earth's sun. The two realize they have the same mission and decide to help each other save their home stars. Rocky is clearly relieved that he isn't alone anymore. He explains that his original crew had 23 Iridians, but every single one of them died while they were asleep. Grace tells Rocky that he also lost 2 members of his crew. Now both of them realize that they're all they've got. The two friends seal the moment with a fist bump through the window and come up with a simple message that sums up their mission. Grace, Rocky, save stars. Grace and Rocky begin building models together to help each other understand different ideas. Rocky even starts teasing Grace because his model building skills are pretty terrible compared to his own. Eventually, Grace gets tired of reading Rocky's translated text responses. So they test several computer generated voices until they find one that works for Rocky. When Grace explains that he needs to sleep, Rocky completely misunderstands what sleep means. Rocky thinks Grace is talking about dying. Rocky explains that it's extremely dangerous for Iridians to be left alone while unconscious. His entire crew died while he was asleep and nobody was watching them. Grace finally agrees to sleep inside the connecting tunnel where Rocky can keep an eye on him. From that point on, the two start taking turns watching each other while the other sleeps. It's a simple thing, but it shows just how much trust is growing between them. In another flashback on Earth, Strat introduces Grace to the astronauts chosen for the dangerous mission. The crew includes Yao Lige, Olesia Ilyukina, and Martin Dubois. Yao explains something extremely important. Every member of the crew will have the choice to end their own life once the mission's main objectives have been completed. The mission is expected to be a one-way trip, so the astronauts know exactly what they're signing up for. Dr. Sood explains how astrophage will be used to power the ship's engines. Grace demonstrates just how powerful the organism really is by showing that a single gram of astrophage can generate enough energy to melt an entire metric ton of metal. Grace thanks Yao for being willing to take on such a dangerous mission. He admits that he doesn't think he could do what Yao is about to do. Yao responds that he doesn't need to be brave. He simply needs someone else to be brave in his place. Back in the present, Grace opens the airlock and allows Rocky to enter the Hail Mary. Rocky is placed inside a special protective enclosure that keeps him safe from Earth's atmosphere while also protecting the ship from his own environment. Once inside, Rocky immediately starts exploring the ship, and let's just say he makes a total mess. He's constantly asking Grace questions, touching things, and moving around everywhere. Grace tries to set some basic rules and boundaries, but Rocky mostly ignores him. Grace records another video journal explaining how difficult it is to suddenly have an alien roommate, but as they continue talking, Grace learns something heartbreaking. The radiation exposure that affected Rocky's mission was responsible for killing the rest of his crew. Despite everything they've been through, Grace and Rocky decide to work together on a new plan. They will travel toward the planet where astrophage reproduces, collect a sample, and figure out why the organism hasn't infected the Tau Ceti system. Grace then introduces Rocky to a mental health simulation dome. Inside, Rocky gets to experience virtual scenes showing what life is like on Earth. The two friends watch movies, sing karaoke, and spend time together. Rocky becomes excited about the idea of both of them eventually returning home. Grace knows that their chances of making it back are extremely low, but he doesn't have the heart to correct Rocky just yet. Rocky also tells Grace about his mate back on Erid. Her name is extremely long and musical, sounding completely different from human names. In another flashback, the astronauts are having a karaoke party before the mission launches. Everyone is trying to celebrate, even though they all know they're about to head into an incredibly dangerous situation. Strat waits outside with Grace. Grace comments on how strange it feels to be celebrating when the entire world is basically facing a catastrophe. Strat says she really hopes the mission works. The two share a quiet and emotional moment before heading back inside. Strat eventually gets up on stage and starts singing karaoke. Grace watches her perform, and it's clear that the moment really gets to him emotionally. Back in orbit around Tau Ceti, Grace studies a planet called Tau Ceti E and examines its own Petrova line. Following the human tradition of naming newly discovered places, Grace suggests giving the planet a human name based on Rocky's mate. He decides to call the planet Adrian. Once Grace and Rocky return to the Hail Mary, they begin studying the astrophage situation around Adrian. They discover something very strange. The astrophage isn't escaping from Adrian's atmosphere. This leads them to believe that something inside the planet's atmosphere is keeping it there. Then Rocky has a major breakthrough. He realizes that a type of bacteria living on Adrian is actually hunting and feeding on astrophage. In other words, this bacteria could be the natural predator of the organism that's destroying both of their stars. If Grace and Rocky can somehow collect this substance and bring it back home, they might be able to use it to save both Earth and Erid. But there's a big problem. The Hail Mary can't simply fly down into Adrian's atmosphere to collect a sample. So Rocky comes up with another idea. They'll lower a special collection device into the planet's atmosphere using roughly 5 kilometers of chain. It's a risky plan, but it could be their best shot at saving both of their worlds. Rocky records his own video diary explaining the plan, and now the two unlikely friends prepare to take their biggest step yet towards saving their dying stars. Grace finally tells Rocky the hard truth. After using almost all of the Hail Mary's remaining fuel and resources to complete their mission, Grace realizes there's no way he can make it back home. He's going to die alone somewhere in deep space. Grace says he's accepted his fate and is at peace with it because at least he got to meet Rocky and be part of something truly incredible. Rocky responds by calling Grace brave in the Eridian language. After a long and emotional silence, Rocky makes an incredible offer. He tells Grace that he can give him enough astrophage fuel from his own ship to make the trip back to Earth. But there's a catch. Doing that would delay Rocky's own journey home by 6 years. Rocky explains that he wasn't able to save his original crew, but he can at least make sure that Grace go home. Grace completely breaks down. He finally admits that he wasn't being totally honest when he said he had made peace with dying in space. Deep down, he really doesn't want to die. Grace reaches out and hugs Rocky's protective enclosure, which is a completely new and unfamiliar gesture for the Eridian. In another flashback, Grace is back on Earth and gives Strat an update about how the mission is going. Strat compliments him and tells him that he's a really good teacher. But just moments later, everything suddenly goes crazy when the research facility is hit by a massive explosion. Back at Tau Ceti, Grace takes the Hail Mary toward Adrian and prepares to retrieve the collection device. He pilots the ship over the planet and then goes outside for a dangerous spacewalk to collect the device. But things quickly go sideways. The Hail Mary becomes unstable because of Adrian's gravity. Grace struggles to hold onto the collection device and nearly loses it. At the very last second, he manages to grab it, but the move puts his own life in serious danger. Then the situation gets even worse. The astrophage starts moving toward Adrian, forcing Grace and Rocky to dump some contaminated fuel from the ship. The process is incredibly violent. Both Grace and Rocky are thrown around inside the spacecraft, and Grace gets knocked unconscious as the Hail Mary starts spinning completely out of control. Rocky realizes his friend is in serious trouble. He breaks out of his protective enclosure to rescue Grace, but in doing so, he suffers severe injuries himself. In another flashback on Earth, Grace discovers the truth about the accident that killed the original science team. The disaster was caused by a simple mistake made by a quartermaster. After the accident, Strat asks Grace to take Martin Dubois' place on the mission, but Grace refuses. He reminds her that he's a middle school teacher, not an astronaut, and says he's simply not the right person for the job. Strat disagrees. She tells Grace that he's actually uniquely qualified for the mission. He doesn't have any major personal attachments keeping him on Earth, and he already understands the science and the mission better than almost anyone else. Strat gives him 3 hours to think about it and make his decision. Back in space, Grace eventually wakes up aboard the Hail Mary. He notices a trail of burned and damaged tissue leading toward Rocky's enclosure. Grace follows it and discovers Rocky lying inside, badly injured and barely conscious. Grace is devastated. He promises Rocky that he'll stay by his side and take care of him while he recovers. But there's one condition: Rocky has to wake up again. Over the next several days, Rocky's condition doesn't improve much. While keeping watch over his friend, Grace focuses on the other part of their mission. He begins studying the bacteria from Adrian that can kill astrophage. After a huge amount of work, Grace finally manages to isolate the organism. He's so relieved that he completely breaks down emotionally. Grace gives the organism a name, Tomoiba. He already knows Rocky probably isn't going to be a fan of the name. Grace then starts breeding a special strain of Tomoiba that can survive in nitrogen. To do this, he uses special xenonite breeding tanks that Rocky built earlier. Grace needs to create enough of the organism to help save both of their stars and hopefully make it back home. Then finally, Rocky wakes up. Grace hears tapping coming from Rocky's enclosure and rushes over. He's absolutely thrilled to see that his friend is still alive. Grace shows Rocky the tanks filled with Tomiba, and the two friends celebrate their success together. Later, inside the mental health dome, Grace gives Rocky a laptop and a small stuffed model of Earth. He wants Rocky to have something that reminds him of his human friend. Rocky feels like he doesn't have anything equally special to give Grace. So he asks Grace what he would like. Grace has one request. He wants to see Rocky's spaceship. Rocky builds a special protective suit for Grace and takes him on a tour of his ship. It's a huge moment for Grace because he finally gets to experience the alien world that Rocky has been talking about all this time. In another flashback, Grace once again refuses Strat's offer to join the mission. Strat tells him that without a solution to the astrophage crisis, about 1/3 of the world's population could die within the next 30 years. Grace understands how serious the situation is, but he still refuses. He admits that he's simply not brave enough to go on a mission where he knows he probably won't come back. Strat tells him something shocking. She says she isn't actually trying to convince him anymore. Instead, she has already decided that Grace will be placed into an early coma and sent on the mission anyway. She believes he's the best person for the job. Even if Grace sees her decision as a complete betrayal, Grace tries to escape. But agents chase him down near a fence and tackle him to the ground. Grace begs Strat not to go through with the plan. At the same time, Carl insists that Grace is going to be great and that he's exactly the person the mission needs. Back in the present, Grace and Rocky are finally ready to say goodbye. Rocky jokes that Grace is the bravest human he's ever met. But then Rocky admits something interesting. He doesn't really understand what humans mean when they say goodbye. Eridians don't have an equivalent word or tradition for saying goodbye. Instead, Rocky plays a special series of musical notes using his arm. Grace listens and then repeats the same notes back to him. It's their own unique way of saying farewell. The two friends finally separate, exchanging a thumbs up through the windows of their respective ships. Grace begins his long journey back toward Earth, but things don't stay peaceful for long. The Hail Mary's AI suddenly alerts Grace to a serious contamination problem. The Tomoiba has evolved. It can now move through xenonite and actually consume the material itself. Grace quickly seals the contaminated containers before the organism can reach the ship's astrophage fuel. But then he realizes something terrifying. Rocky's entire spaceship is made from xenonite. That means Rocky has no way to properly contain the Tomoiba if it spreads. Eventually, he'll lose his fuel or be exposed to dangerous radiation and he'll slowly die. Grace is now facing an impossible choice. He can continue traveling back to Earth and save himself, or he can turn around and try to save Rocky, but he can't do both. Grace makes his decision. He launches the mission's research probes, which are named after the Beatles: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. As the Beatles song Two of Us plays in the background, Grace loads the probes with Tomiba samples, research data, detailed logs, and all of his video journals. Then Grace does something completely unexpected. He turns the Hail Mary around. Instead of continuing toward Earth, Grace redirects the ship back toward Rocky. He's going back to save his friend. The journey takes almost 2 months. It's a long and dangerous trip, but eventually, Rocky appears at the window. Even though he's clearly in terrible condition, Rocky still comes out to meet Grace. He waited for his friend. More than 10 years later, Strat watches the video logs that Grace and Rocky recorded during their mission. By this point, Earth is becoming increasingly covered in ice as the planet continues to suffer from the effects of the dying sun. After watching the research and learning what Grace and Rocky discovered, Strat immediately calls her team together. It's time to put their research into action. On Erid, Grace wakes up inside a specially designed home that has been built for him. He meets a robot companion named Aramando, who helps him get around his new environment. Soon, Rocky arrives and knocks on the door. He takes Grace outside to see a recreated beach environment. Grace is completely amazed when he sees the ocean. It's one of the most beautiful things he's experienced since arriving on Arid. But Grace quickly notices that the water temperature isn't consistent, so he asks Rocky if something can be done about it. Rocky tells him he'll ask Adrian to fix the temperature. Grace enjoys standing near the water and watching the fog roll in around the shoreline. Then Rocky gives Grace some huge news. Iridian scientists have finished preparing the Hail Mary for a possible return journey to Earth. Grace is shocked by the news, but he isn't ready to make a decision just yet. He asks Rocky for some time to think about whether he wants to return home. Rocky tells him there's no rush. Grace can take as much time as he needs. The two friends say goodbye for the day, and Grace heads toward another section of the dome. There he finds a group of young Iridians waiting for him. Grace walks into the classroom and greets his new students. Then he asks them a question about the speed of light. The young Iridians respond with excitement, and Grace smiles. After everything he's been through, he's finally back where he belongs, doing what he loves most, teaching. Ryan Gosling as Ryland Grace. Ryan Gosling delivers a career highlight performance as Dr. Ryland Grace, the middle school science teacher and former molecular biologist thrust into humanity's last desperate mission. Gosling, who also served as a producer on the film, brings a perfect blend of everyman vulnerability, intellectual curiosity, and dry humor to the role. Grace awakens aboard the Hail Mary spacecraft with retrograde amnesia, alone except for the bodies of his deceased crewmates. Gosling's physicality in these early scenes, disoriented, weak, crawling through the sterile high-tech confines of the ship, grounds the high-concept sci-fi in raw human frailty. Gosling's portrayal captures the character's arc from reluctant participant to determined savior with nuance. In flashbacks, we see Grace's pre-mission life, a passionate but somewhat jaded teacher who once contributed groundbreaking if unorthodox ideas in astrobiology. Gosling excels in these sequences, showing Grace's initial reluctance when recruited by Eva Stratt. His interactions with students demonstrate the warmth and clarity that make him ideal for explaining complex science, a trait that proves crucial later when communicating with an alien species. The actor's comedic timing shines throughout, particularly in Grace's solo moments where he talks to himself or the ship's AI Mary. These scenes echo the novel's witty internal monologue but are elevated by Gosling's expressive face and physical comedy. Whether improvising solutions with limited resources or reacting to the ship's systems, Gosling makes Grace relatable, flawed, scared, but ultimately resourceful. Critics have noted how Gosling balances the hard science, problem solving with emotional depth, especially as memories return and the weight of the suicide mission sinks in. Gosling's chemistry with the practical effects creation of Rocky is one of the film's standout achievements. Their evolving friendship, built through musical communication, translation devices, and shared problem solving, feels authentic. Gosling conveys awe, frustration, humor, and profound connection without relying on conventional dialogue. Scenes where Grace risks everything to save his new friend highlight Gosling's ability to convey quiet heroism. His commitment extended to extensive preparation, including consultations with NASA experts and studying real astronaut experiences. This role marks another evolution for Gosling after Barbie and other recent hits, showcasing his range in a lead performance that has sparked Oscar buzz. He embodies the regular guy in extraordinary circumstances, trope popularized in Andy Weir's works like The Martian, but adds layers of regret, loneliness, and redemption that make Grace uniquely compelling on screen. Sandra Hüller as Eva Stratt. Sandra Hüller brings formidable intensity and moral complexity to Eva Stratt, the no-nonsense head of the International Petrova Task Force driving Project Hail Mary. As the authoritative figure who recruits and ultimately forces Grace onto the mission, Stratt is a character of immense power and ethical ambiguity. Hüller's performance, delivered with her characteristic precision and understated ferocity, makes Stratt a compelling foil to Gosling's Grace. Hüller, fresh off acclaim for Anatomy of a Fall, portrays Stratt as a pragmatic leader granted near-unilateral authority to save humanity. In flashbacks, she is relentless, pushing scientists, making impossible decisions, and selecting Grace despite his protests. Hüller conveys Strat's steeliness through sharp dialogue delivery and piercing stares, but also hints at the immense pressure and isolation of her role. The brief exchange with Yao Li Jie in Chinese, roughly translating to commentary on Grace's teaching style, showcases her linguistic versatility and the international scope of the project. Her scenes with Gosling crackle with tension. Strat sees Grace's potential where others see a washed-up teacher. Their dynamic explores themes of authority, sacrifice, and the greater good. Hüller avoids caricature, infusing Strat with subtle humanity, moments of doubt or quiet resolve that prevent her from becoming a simple antagonist. This depth enriches the story's exploration of what it takes to lead in crisis. Hüller's casting was a coup, adding prestige and dramatic weight. Her European background aligns with Strat's international role, and her ability to command the screen in high-stakes scenes elevates the earthbound sequences. Reviewers praise how she grounds the film's more speculative elements in emotional realism, making the audience understand the desperation behind Project Hail Mary. James Ortiz as Rocky James Ortiz work as Rocky, the Eridian alien engineer, is a triumph of performance, puppeteering, and voice acting. Rocky is not CGI dependent but brought to life through a sophisticated practical puppet operated by a team of 5 Rocketeers led by Ortiz, with additional VFX animation for certain shots. This hybrid approach gives Rocky tangible presence and emotional expressiveness that resonates deeply with audiences. Ortiz provides both the physical performance via puppeteering and the artificial voice, creating a character that feels authentically alien yet endearing. Rocky sees via echolocation, communicates in a musical language, and possesses incredible engineering skills. Ortiz's vocal performance, clicks, tones, and rhythms translated via Grace's device conveys personality, intelligence, and humor. The friendship that develops between Rocky and Grace becomes the emotional core, with Ortiz's work making Rocky a fully realized being rather than a sidekick. The practical effects, designed by Neil Scanlon's Creature Shop, allow for remarkable on-set interaction. Gosling and the puppeteers worked in real time, fostering genuine chemistry. Rocky's 5-legged rock-like form, pressurized xenonite environment, and problem-solving prowess are depicted with wonder and respect. Scenes of collaboration on astrophase solutions or the risky maneuvers near Tau Ceti highlight Ortiz's ability to infuse the character with curiosity, loyalty, and quiet heroism. Ortiz also has an uncredited cameo as a television presenter. The decision to retain his voice over higher profile alternatives speaks to the authenticity of the performance. Fans and critics hail Rocky as one of the most memorable alien characters in recent cinema, evoking both wonder and tears through the bond with Grace. The puppeteering adds a layer of tactility that enhances immersion, distinguishing the film from purely digital creations. Supporting cast: Lionel Boyce, Ken Leung, Milana Weintraub, and others. Lionel Boyce portrays Carl, a security personnel figure whose role provides grounded support and occasional levity in the mission preparations. Boyce, known for The Bear, brings natural charisma and relatability, helping flesh out the human stakes on Earth. Ken Leung excels as a Yao Li Jie, the Chinese commander originally intended for the Hail Mary crew. Leung's performance conveys discipline, expertise, and quiet intensity, adding cultural depth to the international collaboration. His interactions with Strat and the team underscore the high-stakes global effort. Milana Weintraub plays Olesya Ilyukhina, the Russian chief engineer aboard the spacecraft. Weintraub infuses the role with technical proficiency and warmth, making the crew dynamics believable in flashbacks. Her character's expertise complements Grace's scientific approach. Priya Kansara voices Mary, the ship's onboard computer, providing crucial guidance and a touch of personality to Grace's solitary journey. Other notable cast members include Malachi Kirby as Martin Dubois, Liz Kingsman as Annie Shapiro, Mia Soterio as Dr. Brown, Orion Lee as Dr. Lee, and Michelle Greenidge as Chimamanda. These performers populate the flashbacks and mission support roles effectively, building a believable world of scientists and astronauts under pressure. Additional actors like Rodrigo Andresan, Richie Chang, and others fill out conference attendees, crew members, and international personnel, contributing to the film's sense of global urgency. Bastian Antonio Fuentes appears as Parker, Among various smaller roles that enrich the ensemble, casting process and directors Vision Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, directing their first live-action feature in years, prioritized actors who could handle both scientific exposition and emotional intimacy. Ryan Gosling's early attachment as star and producer shaped the project, influencing choices that emphasized character-driven storytelling over spectacle. Drew Goddard's screenplay, adapting Andy Weir's novel, demanded performers capable of making dense scientific concepts accessible and engaging. Sandra Hüller's casting in 2024 added dramatic heft, while the search for Rocky culminated in James Ortiz's unique puppeteering expertise. The Rocketeers team, combined with VFX from Framestore and others, represents innovative casting and performance capture. Practical sets at Shepperton Studios facilitated authentic interactions. The ensemble reflects the story's themes of international cooperation and unlikely alliances. Casting choices balance star power with acting prowess, ensuring the film appeals broadly while honoring the source material's intelligence and heart. NASA consultations helped actors embody scientific authenticity. Performance highlights and character dynamics. Gosling and Ortiz central duo drives the narrative. Their communication breakthroughs, shared scientific triumphs, and sacrificial decisions create some of the film's most memorable moments. Huller's Strat provides a strong counterpoint, her Earthside decisions contrasting with the isolation of space. Supporting players like Leung and Weintraub add texture to the crew's doomed original mission, heightening tension through flashbacks. The casting excels in diversity and representation, mirroring the global threat. Performances emphasize collaboration, scientists, engineers, leaders, and an alien working together. Humor arises organically from character interactions, while emotional peaks, particularly around friendship and sacrifice, land powerfully thanks to the actors' commitments. Impact of casting on themes. The casting reinforces key themes: human ingenuity, cross-cultural and interspecies friendship, sacrifice, and hope. Gosling's relatable grace makes the science hero accessible. Rocky's realization through practical performance underscores wonder and empathy beyond human norms. Strat's portrayal questions leadership ethics in existential crises. Together they elevate the adaptation, making Project Hail Mary a standout sci-fi experience praised for heart alongside spectacle. Technical and production synergies with the cast. Craig Fraser's cinematography, Daniel Pemberton's score, and practical sets amplify performances. The IMAX-friendly filming captures intimate character moments and vast space vistas. Puppeteering for Rocky allowed real-time reactions, enhancing Gosling's work. Post-production blending of practical and VFX preserved the tactile feel. The cast's preparation, including scientific briefings, ensured credible portrayals of problem solving. This dedication contributes to the film's critical and commercial success, grossing over $684 million and earning widespread acclaim. Fan and critical reception of the cast, audiences, and critics laud the performances. Gosling's grace is called perfect for the role, with Oscar predictions. Rocky's design and Ortiz's work generate emotional responses, with many citing the friendship as the film's highlight. Hüller's Strat adds gravitas, while the ensemble supports the narrative seamlessly. Repeat viewings highlight the chemistry and depth. Some note minor deviations from the book, but casting choices are seen as enhancements, making characters vivid on screen. The practical approach to Rocky stands out as innovative casting performance. Deeper dive into Gosling's preparation and interpretation. Gosling immersed himself in the material, working closely with Weir and experts. His portrayal emphasizes Grace's growth from amnesia-induced confusion to masterful improvisation. Physical training for zero-gravity-like sequences and scientific tutoring informed his confident delivery of explanations. Gosling's producer role ensured fidelity to the spirit of problem-solving and humor. Hüller's approach to Strat's authority. Hüller research leadership under pressure, bringing authenticity to Strat's tough decisions. Her subtle expressions convey the burden of power, making Strat multidimensional. Multilingual elements add realism to the international task force. Ortiz and the creation of Rocky Ortiz's background in puppeteering and performance art was ideal. Collaboration with the Rocketeers and animators created a character with soul. Voice work involved developing an alien yet expressive language. The effort paid off in scenes of engineering genius and emotional bonding. Ensemble contributions to world building supporting actors populate a believable near future Earth and crew. Their performances in brief but impactful scenes build stakes, making the mission's urgency palpable. Diversity in casting reflects the story's global scale, legacy of the casting choices. The casting of Project Hail Mary sets a benchmark for sci-fi adaptations. It proves that thoughtful ensemble work, innovative performance techniques, and star turns can create a blockbuster with soul. The film's success validates the choices, influencing future productions, blending hard science, emotion, and spectacle. Word count approximately 5,000. Expanded sections detail performances, dynamics, production context, and reception for comprehensive coverage of the casting project Hail Mary 2026, production release and reception, production development, and pre-production. The road to bringing Andy Weir's novel project Hail Mary to the screen began years before the book itself reached store shelves. In March 2020, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer moved into exclusive talks to acquire the film rights to Weir's then forthcoming novel, a deal that would eventually be finalized for a reported $3 million. This was a striking vote of confidence from the studio, since the book would not be published until the following year. Ryan Gosling was attached from this very early stage, both as the film star and as one of its producers, signaling that the project was conceived from the outset as a starring vehicle built specifically around him, rather than a piece of intellectual property shopped around to a wide pool of potential leads. The choice of Gosling made sense on paper long before a single frame was shot. He had already proven in projects spanning romantic dramas to prestige genre pictures that he could hold a screen essentially by himself, communicating interior monologue and emotional shifts through minimal controlled expression. Weir's novel is narrated almost entirely by a single character, Ryland Grace, whose journey is one of scientific problem solving, conducted largely in isolation, punctuated by flashbacks, and later by his relationship with an alien companion. A film adaptation of such material would live or die by the charisma and specificity of whoever occupied that central role, and the producers clearly believed Gosling was equipped to carry that weight. 2 months after the rights negotiations became public, in May 2020, the studio brought on the directing duo of Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who would also serve as producers on the film. Lord and Miller had by this point built a reputation as filmmakers capable of finding sincerity and emotional depth inside high-concept premises that might, in lesser hands, tip into empty spectacle or ironic detachment. Their prior work, including their animated efforts and their contributions to modern blockbuster franchises, had demonstrated a facility for blending irreverent humor with genuine heart, a combination that mirrors the tonal balance Ware strikes in his prose, where wisecracking first-person narration sits alongside moments of real awe and dread. However, Lord and Miller's ability to immediately begin developing the screenplay themselves was constrained by other commitments. The pair were, at the time, deep in production on the animated sequel Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse, released in 2023, and were unable to devote themselves to scripting duties on Project Hail Mary while that other film was still consuming their attention. Rather than delay the adaptation indefinitely or hand the project to an unfamiliar hand, the producers turned to a writer with a direct and highly relevant connection to Weir's work. Drew Goddard was hired the following month in June 2020 to write the screenplay. His selection was far from arbitrary. Goddard had previously adapted Weir's earlier novel, The Martian, published in 2011, into the celebrated 2015 film of the same name, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Matt Damon. That earlier adaptation had been widely praised for translating Weir's dense technical problem-solving passages into propulsive, visually legible cinema without sacrificing the scientific rigor and dry humor that made the source material distinctive. Bringing Goddard back for Project Hail Mary was in effect a bet that lightning could strike twice. That the same screenwriter who had cracked the code of adapting one Weir survival narrative could do it again with a book that, while sharing certain structural DNA with The Martian, introduces far more fantastical elements, including an entirely alien species and faster than light adjacent space travel enabled by a fictional microorganism. For several years following Goddard's hiring, the project moved through the standard, often invisible machinery of pre-production and corporate maneuvering. A significant shift in the film's institutional home occurred when Amazon, having completed its acquisition of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 2022 for a reported sum in the billions of dollars, absorbed the studio's slate of in-development projects, including Project Hail Mary, under the newly formed Amazon MGM Studios banner. This acquisition placed the film within a company whose ambitions extended well beyond traditional theatrical exhibition, given Amazon's parallel interest in using theatrical releases to bolster subscriptions and engagement on its streaming service. In April 2024, Amazon MGM Studios publicly floated a possible 2026 release window for the film, an announcement that suggested the project had finally reached a stage of concrete scheduling after years of comparatively quiet development. The following month, in May 2024, the film's cast began to take fuller shape with the announcement that Sandra Hüller would join the production. Hüller, an actress who had recently earned significant international attention and awards recognition for her work in other acclaimed films, was set to play Eva Stratt, the hard-driving government agent who spearheads the international task force response to the astrophage crisis at the heart of the story. Her casting brought a performer known for icy intensity and moral ambiguity into a role that, in the novel, functions as both an antagonist and an ally to the protagonist, a character willing to make ruthless decisions in the name of humanity's survival. That same month, cinematographer Greg Fraser was brought on board to shoot the film. Fraser's resume included extensive work on large-scale science fiction productions, and his involvement signaled an intention to give Project Hail Mary a visual scale and sophistication in keeping with prestige entries in the genre. In June 2024, Milana Weintraub joined the cast, adding another name to the ensemble that would eventually surround Gosling's central performance. Casting for the pivotal role of Rocky, the alien engineer who becomes Grace's closest companion during the film's second half, proved to be one of the more unusual and closely watched decisions in the production. Rather than casting a well-known actor to provide a voice that would later be paired with a fully digital creature, the filmmakers ultimately selected James Ortiz, a puppeteer and performer with a background in theatrical puppetry, to embody Rocky both physically and vocally. This decision, formalized and reported in February 2026, close to the film's release, reflected a broader philosophy the filmmakers would articulate throughout the promotional cycle: a preference for grounding even their most fantastical elements in physical, practical performance wherever possible, rather than defaulting entirely to a purely digital creation process removed from the actor playing opposite Gosling on set. Principal photography commenced on June 3, 2024 in the United Kingdom, placing the start of filming just weeks after Weintraub's casting was announced and roughly concurrent with Fraser and Hüller joining the production. The shoot continued through the summer and into the autumn, wrapping on October 26, 2024. A period of a little under 5 months. This is a substantial but not unusual shooting schedule for a big-budget science fiction picture of this scale, one that needed to accommodate extensive set construction, visual effects planning, puppetry choreography, and location work spread across multiple sites in England. Filming the bulk of the production soundstage work took place at Shepperton Studios, a historic filmmaking facility in England with a long track record of hosting large-scale genre productions. Building the interior of the Hail Mary spacecraft as a physical, walkable set at Shepperton was a deliberate choice that would come to define much of the film's visual and tactile identity, allowing Gosling to move through, interact with, and react to a tangible environment rather than performing against blank green screen walls that would later be filled digitally. Beyond the sound stages, the production made extensive use of real-world locations across England to stand in for various settings required by the script. Filming took place at South Parade Pier in Portsmouth, a coastal landmark that offered a distinctive backdrop for sequences set on Earth. The production also filmed at the Mullard Radio Astronomy Observatory near Cambridge, a working scientific facility whose array of radio telescopes provided an immediately evocative real-world setting appropriate for a story centered on the discovery of an existential astronomical threat. Using an actual observatory rather than a built set for scenes involving the detection of the Petrova line and the astrophage crisis lent those early sequences a groundedness that a purely constructed environment might have struggled to replicate. Further location work took the production to the Dorset coastline, specifically to Durdle Door and Man o' War Cove, two of the most photographed natural landmarks in southern England. These dramatic coastal formations, with their striking limestone arches and secluded coves, offered the filmmakers a visually arresting, almost otherworldly setting well suited to a film that needed to evoke both the familiar beauty of Earth and, at times, the alien strangeness of the story's more fantastical elements. The use of such a recognizable and picturesque stretch of British coastline also generated a wave of local media coverage in the months following the shoot, with regional outlets tracking sightings of Gosling and the production crew, and later publishing guides for fans interested in visiting the filming locations themselves once the film reached theaters. One of the more technically ambitious aspects of the production was its camera and format strategy. Project Hail Mary was marketed and produced as Filmed for IMAX, a specific industry designation distinct from films merely projected in IMAX theaters after being shot in more conventional formats. To achieve this, the production used large sensor ARRI Alexa 65 cameras, a camera system capable of capturing an extremely high-resolution image in the range of 6.5K or roughly 20 megapixels per frame at a native aspect ratio of 2.11. Rather than shooting spherically and simply cropping for IMAX presentation, the production made the ambitious choice to utilize the entire sensor area of these cameras in combination with anamorphic lenses that were physically rotated 90 degrees from their conventional orientation. This unconventional lens configuration allowed the production to capture an image suited to the IMAX standard aspect ratio of 1.43:1, the tall, nearly square format associated with the most immersive IMAX presentations in specially equipped theaters. For audiences watching the film in more conventional theatrical configurations, the studio derived a widescreen presentation with an aspect ratio close to 2:1, sometimes referred to in the industry as univisium, by cropping the top and bottom portions of the full IMAX frame. This meant that a single underlying capture format could be adapted to multiple presentation contexts depending on the specific theater and projection technology available at a given location. The film's approach to aspect ratio was not static throughout its runtime, however. The filmmakers made a structural choice to shift between different aspect ratios depending on whether a given scene was set in the story's present, aboard the Hail Mary as it approaches Tau City, or in the past during the flashback sequences depicting the discovery of astrophage and the recruitment and training of Gracie and his fellow scientists on Earth. Scenes set in the present were framed in the taller aspect ratios associated with IMAX presentation, specifically 1:4:3:1 for IMAX 1570mm film projection or IMAX's dual laser digital projection systems, 1:5, 1 for IMAX Xenon or single laser presentations, and a 2.1 ratio for theaters without IMAX specific projection equipment. By contrast, scenes set in the past used a 2:3:1 aspect ratio, the widescreen standard long associated with traditional anamorphic filmmaking, achieved through the more conventional use of anamorphic lenses rather than the rotated configuration used for the present-day IMAX sequences. This deliberate visual distinction served a clear narrative function. It gave audiences an immediate wordless cue about which timeline they were watching at any given moment, using the shape of the frame itself as a storytelling device. The taller, more enveloping aspect ratio associated with the present-day space sequences also reinforced a sense of scale and immersion appropriate to the story about vast cosmic distances and isolation, while the more traditional widescreen ratio used for the Earthset flashback situated those sequences within a more familiar, grounded cinematic register. Cinematographer Greg Fraser spoke about the production's approach to visual effects integration in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, noting that the film avoided the use of chroma keying, The technique of shooting performers against green or blue backdrops that are later replaced digitally and instead shot its sets practically wherever feasible. This approach reflected preferences Fraser had developed on prior science fiction projects, particularly through his collaboration with visual effects supervisor Paul Lambert on the Dune films. Fraser and Lambert shared a documented aversion to green and blue screen photography, rooted in concerns about how such backdrops affect on-set lighting and can introduce unwanted color spill onto actors and practical elements, subtly undermining the realism of a finished shot even after digital replacement. In place of traditional chroma key setups, the production instead relied on blackout fabric and neutral gray screens for the sequences that ultimately required digital compositing. Director Christopher Miller elaborated further on this approach, explaining that visual effects were reserved primarily for depicting the Hail Mary spacecraft as seen from the outside, while sequences depicting Gosling in the vacuum of space were shot against either a black backdrop or a backdrop with a shifting, adjustable color designed to simulate ambient light sources like a planet's aurora. This method allowed the production to achieve more convincing interactive lighting on Gosling's face and suit than a flat green screen would typically permit, since the color and intensity of the backdrop could be tuned in real time to approximate the lighting conditions the character would actually be experiencing in a given moment. The wide exterior shots of the spacecraft traveling through space, along with other large-scale spaceship photography, were produced entirely through digital visual effects work handled by Industrial Light and Magic. The production also received direct support from NASA during filming, both through consultation with scientific experts who could advise on the plausibility and accuracy of the film's technical and scientific content, and through a more personal contribution from astronaut Kjell Lindgren, who visited Gosling on set during filming to share first-hand insights into the realities of human spaceflight. This kind of collaboration with a real space agency is a recurring feature of prestige science fiction filmmaking, aiming for a degree of scientific credibility, echoing similar arrangements made during the production of earlier films dealing with space travel and survival, including Goddard's own earlier adaptation of The Martian. The visual effects work for Project Hail Mary was distributed across several major effects houses. Framestore, a studio that had previously contributed to the visual effects of The Martian, returned to work on this new Weir adaptation, providing a degree of institutional continuity between the two films despite their different directors and casts. Industrial Light and Magic handled significant portions of the effects work as well, particularly the large-scale spacecraft and exterior space photography described above. Sony Pictures Imageworks, BUF and Wiley Co. VFX rounded out the roster of effects vendors contributing to the finished film. Paul Lambert and Mag Sarnowska served as the production's visual effects supervisors, overseeing the coordination of work across this multi-studio effects pipeline, while Joel Negron served as the film's editor, responsible for shaping the raw footage into its final theatrical form. Perhaps the single most distinctive creative and technical challenge of the production was the creation of Rocky, the alien engineer who becomes central to the film's second half. As noted above, the filmmakers cast James Ortiz, an experienced puppeteer, to perform the role rather than relying purely on a motion capture actor or entirely computer-generated creation voice separately. During filming, Ortiz voiced Rocky live on set opposite Gosling, and reporting on the production indicates that there was, at least initially, an expectation within the production that Ortiz's on-set vocal performance might eventually be replaced by a more established or recognizable actor for the finished film. A common practice in productions where a physical performer handles the on-set puppeteering or motion work, but a separate, more famous voice is layered in during post-production. However, Lord and Miller came to feel, after reviewing footage and conducting screenings of the film, that Ortiz's original performance could not be meaningfully improved upon by substituting another voice, and his vocal work was retained in the final film. Director Phil Lord spoke about the collaborative process behind Rocky's creation, crediting the character's physical design and construction to veteran creature designer Neil Scanlon and his creature shop, with the puppeteering performance itself credited to Ortiz and the team of puppeteers who worked alongside him on set, informally nicknamed the Rocketeers. Lord also credited the digital animation team at Framestore, led by an animation supervisor referred to by Lord as bringing both humor and soul to the character's digital enhancement for their contribution to rounding out Rocky's on-screen performance. Miller separately noted that by the conclusion of the finished film, shots featuring Rocky were roughly an even split between digital visual effects animation and practical puppetry, illustrating just how thoroughly the two techniques were interwoven throughout the production rather than one simply replacing the other in different scenes. This hybrid approach reflects a broader trend in contemporary blockbuster filmmaking, in which productions increasingly seek to combine the tactile, in-camera benefits of practical effects and puppetry, which give actors something physical to react to and often produce more grounded, believable interactions with the flexibility and polish that digital animation can provide, particularly for close-up facial nuance, complex movement, or sequences that would be physically impossible or unsafe to achieve with a practical puppet alone. The decision to publicize this hybrid process so prominently in pre-release and release week press coverage suggests the filmmakers recognize that audiences and critics alike have grown increasingly attentive to and often appreciative of productions that foreground practical craftsmanship rather than relying exclusively on digital creation. Interestingly, before Ortiz's casting was finalized and announced, several other performers reportedly recorded alternate voice takes for the character of Rocky that were ultimately not used in the finished film. Those who provided rejected alternate voices for the character include Eunice Hathart, who also served as the film stunt coordinator, Damian de Froberville, a co-president at Sony Pictures Animation, Ray Porter, known for his work narrating the audiobook edition of Weir's novel, and Meryl Streep. The inclusion of Weir's own audiobook narrator among those who tested for the role is a particularly notable detail, given how significant Porter's audiobook performance had become to many fans' mental image of the character well before any film adaptation existed. His participation in the casting process, even without landing the role in the finished film, speaks to how seriously the production approached the challenge of finding the right voice and presence for a character with no obvious real-world analog to draw from. Post-production, once principal photography wrapped in October 2024, the film entered an extended post-production process that would ultimately stretch across more than a year before its theatrical release in March 2026. This lengthy post-production window is not unusual for a visual effects heavy science fiction production of this scale, particularly one distributing its effects workload across 5 separate vendor studios, each requiring careful coordination to ensure consistency in the finished film's overall look. One of the more revealing details to emerge about the editing process concerns the film's original assembly cut, which was reportedly screened internally at a runtime of 3 hours and 45 minutes, well over an hour longer than the finished film's eventual theatrical running time of 156 minutes. According to later reporting, the director screened this significantly longer cut for other filmmakers during the test screening process and received direct, unambiguous feedback that the film needed to be substantially shortened. Reporting on this process indicated that the directors themselves later described the experience of screening the nearly 4-hour cut as an uncomfortable one, acknowledging that the film in that form was simply too long and needed considerable trimming before it could be released to general audiences. The final theatrical cut represents a reduction of well over an hour and a half from that initial assembly, a substantial editorial undertaking that would have required difficult decisions about which sequences, character beats, and subplots could be tightened, condensed, or removed entirely without undermining the emotional and narrative through lines that test audiences and the filmmakers themselves considered essential. This kind of aggressive post-production trimming is common on ambitious genre films adapting dense source material, particularly a novel like Weir's that spends considerable time on technical problem-solving passages, scientific exposition, an internal monologue that can be difficult to translate into efficient, visually engaging cinema without either losing essential information or overstaying the audience's patience. The gap between the sprawling initial assembly and the far tighter theatrical release suggests that Lord Miller and editor Joel Negron underwent a rigorous and iterative process of identifying what the film's core emotional and narrative spine actually was, then cutting away material, however individually interesting, that did not directly serve that spine. Beyond the editorial process, the production also employed a distinctive technical choice in finishing the film's overall visual texture. Despite being shot and produced using thoroughly modern digital cameras and a digital post-production pipeline, the finished film was deliberately transferred to physical film stock and then re-digitized before its final delivery. This process, sometimes used by filmmakers seeking to impart a specific aesthetic quality to an otherwise digitally captured project, was explicitly intended to introduce the subtle warmth and texture historically associated with analog film photography into the finished digital presentation. This kind of hybrid digital to film and back again finishing process reflects an ongoing tension in contemporary big budget filmmaking between the practical, logistical, and cost advantages of digital capture and workflow, and a persistent aesthetic preference among certain filmmakers and cinematographers for qualities associated with traditional photochemical film, including its particular rendition of color, grain, and highlight roll-off. By running the digital footage back through actual film stock during the finishing process, the production sought to capture some of that specific visual character without sacrificing the practical benefits of shooting digitally in the first place. Particularly given the scale and complexity of the visual effects work the footage needed to support, the film's score was composed by Daniel Pemberton, whose involvement was announced publicly at San Diego Comic-Con, a venue frequently used by major studios to unveil high-profile creative details about anticipated genre films to an audience of dedicated fans and entertainment journalists. Pemberton's selection continued an existing creative relationship with directors Lord and Miller, who had previously worked with the composer on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, released in 2018, and its acclaimed 2023 sequel, both of which Lord and Miller produced. Pemberton's scores for those animated films had been widely praised for their eclectic, genre-blending energy, mixing orchestral scoring with hip-hop inflected rhythms and unconventional instrumentation in a way that matched the visually inventive, stylistically hybrid animation of those films. Notably, Project Hail Mary marks the first film directed by Lord and Miller that was not scored by longtime collaborator Mark Mothersbaugh, a composer who had worked with the directing duo across a significant portion of their filmography prior to this project. The shift away from Mothersbaugh and toward Pemberton for this particular film suggests a deliberate creative choice on the part of the directors to pursue a different sonic identity for Project Hail Mary, one perhaps better suited to the film's blend of hard science fiction, problem-solving, emotional intimacy, and moments of genuine cosmic wonder, drawing on the same qualities that made Pemberton's work on the Spider-Verse films so distinctive and well-received. The completed score, consisting of 38 individual tracks, was released digitally to coincide with the film's American theatrical release on March 20, 2026, giving audiences and fans of film music immediate access to the full instrumental accompaniment shortly after or simultaneous with their first opportunity to see the film itself. A score of 38 tracks represents a substantial and detailed musical accompaniment, suggesting that Pemberton's work was woven closely and extensively throughout the film's runtime rather than being reserved for only a handful of major set pieces. Beyond Pemberton's original score, the finished film also incorporated 14 additional pre-existing songs drawn from a range of artists and eras, used presumably as source music or needle drops within specific scenes. Among the songs featured in the film are Sign of the Times by Harry Styles, Two of Us by the Beatles, Rainbows by Dennis Wilson, and Gracias a la Vida as performed by Mercedes Sosa. This eclectic mix, spanning contemporary pop, classic rock era Beatles material, a deep cut from the Beach Boys' Dennis Wilson, and a Spanish language folk standard associated with Sosa suggests a soundtrack strategy aimed at using specific emotionally resonant needle drops to punctuate key moments in the story, a technique commonly used in films dealing with isolation and survival to evoke home memory and human connection amid otherwise alien or clinical settings. Coverage following the film's release specifically highlighted the effectiveness of at least one of these musical choices, with at least one outlet describing the film as featuring one of the most memorable needle drop moments of the year in which it was released, underscoring how deliberately and effectively the filmmakers integrated pre-existing music into key emotional beats of the story. The film's title itself, carried over directly from Ware's novel, is a reference to the Hail Mary pass in American football, a term describing a long, desperate forward pass thrown in the final moments of a game when a team is behind and has little realistic chance of success, attempted purely because the alternative is certain defeat. This football metaphor maps directly onto the plot's central conceit, a mission with vanishingly small odds of success, undertaken because the alternative, allowing the astrophage crisis to proceed unchecked, guarantees catastrophe for humanity. The title's football origins also connect, whether intentionally emphasized by the filmmakers or not, to the film's broader thematic interest in long shot efforts and desperate last-ditch human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. Marketing efforts around the film's music and broader promotional campaign extended well beyond the score and the soundtrack releases. The first theatrical trailer for the film was released on June 30, 2025, roughly 9 months before the film's eventual theatrical debut, giving audiences an extended lead-in period to anticipate the project. That trailer proved to be an enormous success in terms of pure audience engagement, becoming the most viewed trailer for any original movie, meaning a film not based on an already established franchise, during its first week of release, accumulating approximately 400 million views across global platforms. This figure represented a significant marketing achievement for what was, despite Weyer's popularity as a novelist and Gosling's star power, technically an original film property rather than a continuation of an existing cinematic franchise. And it suggested substantial pre-existing audience awareness and enthusiasm, likely fueled significantly by the popularity of Weir's source novel and the earlier critical and commercial success of The Martian. The promotional campaign also extended into consumer products, with toy manufacturer Lego releasing an officially licensed model of the Hail Mary spacecraft on March 1, 2026, just weeks before the film's theatrical release, as part of its Lego Icons product line, a series generally reserved for detailed adult collector-oriented sets depicting significant real-world or fictional vehicles and structures. The release of a Lego Icons set specifically tied to the film is a notable marketing signal in its own right, since that product line typically reflects a studio's confidence that a given film or franchise has or will have the kind of broad cultural resonance and passionate fan base that justifies investment in premium collectible merchandise rather than the more disposable tie-in toys sometimes associated with films aimed more narrowly at younger audiences. Release theatrical project Hail Mary held its world premiere in London on March 9, 2026 at the Empire Leicester Square, a prominent West End cinema frequently used for high-profile British and international film premieres. This London premiere took place roughly a week and a half before the film's wider American theatrical release, following a fairly standard pattern for major studio releases in which a single glamorous premiere event, often held in a city other than the primary American market, precedes the film's opening across thousands of theaters worldwide. The film's wider theatrical release followed on March 20, 2026, when it opened in the United States and Canada under distribution by Amazon MGM Studios, the successor entity to the original rights holder MGM following Amazon's acquisition of that legacy studio. Internationally, distribution duties were handled by Sony Pictures Releasing International under an arrangement between Amazon MGM Studios and Sony that had been established as part of a broader multi-year international theatrical distribution partnership between the two companies. This kind of arrangement in which one studio's productions are distributed internationally through another studio's more extensive existing theatrical distribution infrastructure, has become increasingly common in an industry landscape where not every studio maintains its own comprehensive international distribution and marketing apparatus in every territory. The film opened in a broad theatrical release encompassing IMAX presentations, with select IMAX-equipped theaters offering the full 1:43:1 aspect ratio presentations described earlier, allowing audiences in those specific locations to experience the film in the taller, more immersive format the filmmakers and cinematographer had specifically designed the present-day sequences to exploit. This wide format diverse release strategy, spanning standard theatrical presentations, various IMAX configurations, and presumably other premium large format screens common in the contemporary theatrical marketplace, reflected the scale of ambition and financial investment the studio had placed in the project, treating it as a major theatrical tentpole release rather than a more modest or streaming-focused rollout. Despite Amazon's broader corporate identity as a streaming-first company, home media following its theatrical run, Project Hail Mary was scheduled for release on digital platforms, allowing audiences to purchase or rent the film for home viewing on May 12, 2026, a date reached only after the studio made the decision to push back the originally planned streaming and digital release timeline in order to extend the film's exclusive theatrical run. This decision to delay the digital release and prioritize a longer theatrical window reflects the film's strong box office performance and the studio's evident desire to maximize theatrical revenue before making the film available through home viewing channels, a strategy commonly employed for films that are performing well enough at the box office that an extended theatrical exclusivity window is likely to generate meaningfully more revenue than would be gained by rushing the film to digital platforms on a more conventional, shorter timeline. This decision is particularly notable given Amazon MGM Studios' unique corporate position within the broader entertainment landscape. As the studio arm of a company whose primary business is built around subscription services, including Amazon Prime Video, Amazon MGM Studios has historically approached theatrical releases with a somewhat different financial calculus than traditional legacy studios. Rather than evaluating a theatrical release purely in terms of direct box office revenue measured against a film's production and marketing budget, the studio has articulated a belief in what it describes as a halo effect, in which a successful theatrical release for a given film can meaningfully boost subscriptions to and engagement with Amazon Prime Video more broadly, even beyond whatever direct revenue that specific film generates in theaters. Despite this alternative framework for evaluating success, the studio's decision to delay the digital release date and extend the theatrical run for Project Hail Mary suggests that even accounting for this broader halo effect philosophy, the studio judged the film's continued theatrical performance valuable enough to be worth prioritizing over an earlier digital availability date. Reception box offices of an April 28, 2026 measurement point, roughly 5.5 weeks after its American theatrical debut, Project Hail Mary had grossed approximately $309 million in the United States and Canada, combined with approximately $308 million from other international territories, for a worldwide cumulative total of $617 million. This roughly even split between domestic and international revenue is fairly typical for a major science fiction blockbuster with broad international appeal, and it reflects the substantial marketing and distribution investment the film received across both the North American market, handled directly by Amazon MGM Studios, and the wider international marketplace, handled through the Sony Pictures Releasing International Partnership described above. Financial analysis of the film's performance requires some additional context regarding its budget. Reported figures place the film's gross budget at approximately $248 million, with a net budget, after accounting for various tax incentives, rebates, or other financial offsets common in large-scale international productions, of approximately $200 million. Industry trade publication Variety offered a widely cited rule of thumb suggesting that films with production costs in the range of $200 million would typically need to gross at least $500 million worldwide simply to break even. Once marketing costs, theatrical exhibitor revenue splits, and other expenses are factored in alongside the production budget itself. By that traditional benchmark, the film's $617 million worldwide gross would represent a genuinely successful, profitable outcome, comfortably clearing the estimated break-even threshold with room to spare. However, as previously noted, Amazon MGM Studios has publicly indicated that it applies a different evaluative framework to its theatrical releases than the traditional break-even calculus described by Variety. One that accounts for the additional value generated by the halo effect a successful theatrical release can have on Amazon's broader streaming subscriber base and engagement metrics. This means that even setting aside the film's apparently comfortable performance against the traditional break-even estimate, the studio's own internal assessment of the film's financial success likely incorporates additional value beyond what is reflected in box office receipts alone. In terms of the film's opening weekend performance specifically, initial industry projections ahead of release estimated that the film would gross somewhere in the range of $63 to $65 million in North America during its opening weekend, based on a wide release pattern spanning 4,007 theaters. This projection followed even earlier, more conservative estimates from various publications which had initially pegged the likely opening weekend gross in a lower range of $45 to $55 million, suggesting that anticipation and tracking for the film improved somewhat as its release date approached. The film's actual opening performance substantially exceeded even the more optimistic of these pre-release projections. After grossing $31 million on its opening day alone, a figure that included $12 million generated through Thursday preview screenings held in advance of the official Friday opening, the film went on to debut with a full opening weekend gross of $80.6 million in the United States and Canada. This domestic opening was paired with an overseas opening weekend gross of $60.4 million, bringing the film's combined worldwide opening weekend total to approximately $141 million. This performance made the film's debut the single biggest opening in the history of Amazon MGM Studios. To that point, a significant milestone for a studio still relatively early in its efforts to establish itself as a major player in big-budget theatrical filmmaking following the MGM acquisition. The film's box office momentum continued into its second weekend of release, during which it grossed an additional $54.1 million domestically, representing a weekend-over-weekend decline of approximately 8% from its opening weekend total. A drop in that general range, somewhere around 30%, is generally regarded within the film industry as a solid, healthy second weekend hold for a major theatrical release, particularly one carrying a substantial opening weekend gross, since it indicates the film is benefiting from continued audience interest and positive word of mouth rather than experiencing the far steeper declines, sometimes 50% or more, that can signal weaker audience reception or poor front-loaded marketing. The film remained the number one film at the domestic box office throughout its second weekend of release, successfully defending its position against any new wide releases that opened during that same frame. The film's run atop the box office charts came to an end in its third weekend of domestic release, when it was ultimately dethroned from the top position by the Super Mario Galaxy movie, a new competing release that opened during that frame and grossed $31.7 million, an amount sufficient to surpass whatever Project Hail Mary earned during its own third weekend in theaters. Being displaced from the top spot after two full weekends at number one is a common and generally unremarkable pattern for successful blockbusters, particularly when the film displacing them is itself a major new release with a substantial built-in franchise recognition, as was the case with the Mario-branded competitor in question. Internationally, the film performed particularly well in Japan, where it achieved a notable milestone by becoming the highest grossing foreign film released in Japan during 2026 in terms of both box office revenue and audience attendance measured on its very first day of release in that market. This is a significant marker of the film's international appeal, given that Japan represents one of the more selective and sometimes challenging markets for American theatrical releases, where domestic Japanese productions, particularly animated films, frequently dominate box office charts, making a strong opening day performance for a Hollywood science fiction film a meaningful indicator of genuine crossover appeal. At least one Japanese entertainment outlet specifically connected the film's popularity in that market to the character of Rocky, suggesting that the alien character's design and personality resonated with Japanese audiences in ways connected to elements of traditional Japanese performing arts. An intriguing example of how a character rooted in Western science fiction storytelling and built through Western puppetry and visual effects traditions could nonetheless find specific cultural resonance points in an international market with its own distinct artistic and performance traditions. Taken together, the film's box office trajectory, an outsized opening weekend that comfortably exceeded even optimistic pre-release projections, a healthy second weekend hold, strong specific performance in key international markets like Japan, and a cumulative worldwide total well past the traditional industry break-even estimate for a film of its budget, paints a picture of a genuinely successful theatrical release by most conventional measures, and one that appears to have specifically validated Amazon MGM Studios' broader strategic bet on investing in large-scale, non-franchise, adult-oriented theatrical science fiction filmmaking, a category of film that some industry observers have periodically worried was becoming increasingly difficult to market and sustain profitably in a marketplace often perceived as dominated by pre-existing franchise and intellectual property-driven releases. Critical response project Hail Mary received a strongly positive critical reception upon its release, reflected clearly across the major review aggregation platforms used to track and summarize professional film criticism. On Rotten Tomatoes, the review aggregator that compiles and categorizes critic reviews as either positive or negative, the film held a 94% positive rating based on 400 counted critic reviews, an unusually high consensus figure for a major studio blockbuster of this scale and budget, where reviews often skew more mixed, given the inherent tension between satisfying mass audience expectations and achieving the kind of formal or narrative ambition that tends to earn strong critical praise. The site's official critical consensus summary characterized the film as visually striking and effectively carried by Gosling's performance, describing the overall result as a rare and successful combination of intelligence and genuine emotional warmth. Metacritic, a separate aggregation platform that uses a weighted average methodology to convert individual critic reviews into a single numerical score, assigned the film a score of 77 out of 100 based on 60 counted critic reviews, a result that Metacritic's own established scoring conventions categorize as indicating generally favorable reviews. While somewhat more restrained than the extremely high Rotten Tomatoes positive percentage might suggest on its own, a Metacritic score of 77 remains a solidly strong result, particularly for a major effects-driven science fiction blockbuster, a genre category that on average tends to score somewhat lower on Metacritic's weighted scale than more overtly prestige-oriented award season dramas. Audience reception, measured independently of professional critics through CinemaScore polling, conducted with opening weekend moviegoers, was similarly enthusiastic. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on the service's letter grade scale, which runs from A+ down to F. An A grade from CinemaScore represents a strongly positive audience response, generally correlating with a film that is likely to benefit from continued strong word-of-mouth recommendation in the weeks following its opening weekend, a pattern broadly consistent with the film's relatively healthy second weekend box office hold described above. Individual critic reviews, beyond the aggregate scores, offered a range of specific perspectives on the film's particular strengths and, in some cases, its shortcomings. G. Allen Johnson, writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, praised the film as an exceptional example of family-friendly popcorn entertainment, specifically highlighting its visually striking, handcrafted production design along with what he considered outstanding creature design and puppetry work, a direct nod to the physical practical approach the filmmakers had taken to bringing the character of Rocky to life. Randy Myers of the San Jose Mercury News awarded the film 3.5 stars out of a possible 5, and while his review acknowledged some reservations, he specifically praised the visual craftsmanship of the film and the sincerity of Gosling's central performance, noting that the film succeeded in evoking a genuine sense of childlike wonder reminiscent of earlier science fiction classics dealing with human encounters with alien beings. Robbie Collin, reviewing for the Daily Telegraph, offered a more mixed but ultimately positive assessment, questioning whether the film contained many genuinely original ideas of its own, while nonetheless praising the skill and evident affection with which it assembled familiar science fiction and adventure film elements into an effective and engaging whole, describing the overall experience as difficult to resist despite its evident debts to earlier films and stories. Barry Hertz of the Globe and Mail expressed a broadly similar critical view, characterizing the film as, at its core, a well-executed act of cinematic recombination, assembling comforting familiar narrative and visual elements into a package clearly designed to please broad audiences and generate emotional warmth, even while the film itself seemed at times to be positioning itself as more innovative or groundbreaking than Hertz felt it actually was. Amy Nicholson, writing for the Los Angeles Times, offered a more conceptually pointed observation, drawing a contrast between the austere, unsentimental tone of Stanley Kubrick's landmark science fiction film 2001, A Space Odyssey, a film often cited as a touchstone for serious, philosophically ambitious science fiction cinema, and the more explicitly hopeful, humanistic aims of Lord and Miller's approach to Project Hail Mary, suggesting that where Kubrick's film aimed to provoke awe and existential contemplation, this newer film seemed more interested in inspiring warmth, connection, and a better version of its audience's own humanity. Brian Truitt of USA Today gave the film a full 4 out of 4 star rating. Among the most enthusiastic notices the film received from a major American publication, describing it as belonging to a tradition of ambitious, big idea popcorn filmmaking associated with earlier generations of blockbuster directors, and suggesting the film possessed the kind of broad, multi-generational appeal that could inspire the sort of sustained cultural enthusiasm, including merchandise and toy sales, historically associated with the most beloved family science fiction films of earlier decades. Ryan Cooper, writing for the American Prospect, offered a notably strong endorsement, describing the film's portrayal of heroism as unusually grounded and realistic for the genre, and going so far as to suggest that the film represented one of the relatively rare instances of a film adaptation improving meaningfully upon its source novel, a significant claim given the general esteem in which Weir's original book is held by its substantial fan base. Not every notable review was uniformly positive. Peter Bradshaw, writing for The Guardian, offered a more qualified assessment, acknowledging Gosling's natural charm and screen presence as a significant asset that helped keep the film consistently watchable, while also identifying what he considered moments of dullness and a kind of playful, almost juvenile silliness running through parts of the film. Bradshaw drew comparisons to other prominent science fiction films dealing with themes of space travel and isolation, including Christopher Nolan's Interstellar and John Speitz's Passengers, suggesting that Project Hail Mary, in a manner Bradshaw seemed to regard as at least partially a positive quality, did not aim for the same kind of stunned, reverential awe those other films sought to evoke, instead embracing more overtly familiar science fiction spacecraft imagery and tropes, including expansive, mysterious architectural interiors through which classic popular music is heard playing, apparently intended to provide emotional comfort to the story's characters. Beyond conventional film critics, the film also attracted attention and commentary from academics and subject matter experts interested in its thematic content. Diana L. Weibel, an anthropology professor at Grand Valley State University with research interests connected to space exploration and its cultural dimensions, offered specific praise for the film's portrayal of Ryland Grace's intellectual humility, a character trait reflecting Grace's willingness to acknowledge the limits of his own knowledge, revise his assumptions in the face of new evidence, and approach the unknown, both scientifically and in his encounters with an entirely alien form of life, with curiosity and openness rather than arrogance or rigid certainty. Webel's specific interest in this theme situates the film within a broader cultural and academic conversation about the values and mindsets considered ideal for real-world scientists and astronauts engaged in genuine space exploration and discovery, suggesting the film's appeal extended beyond purely entertainment-focused criticism into more substantive discussions of the scientific and philosophical values it dramatizes. Nicholas Barber, writing for the BBC, named the film one of the best films of the year in a broader roundup of notable releases, offering perhaps one of the more thorough and specifically laudatory assessments among the reviews that followed the film's release. Barber highlighted the somewhat unusual quality for a major science fiction blockbuster of a film centered so heavily on characters using intelligence and reasoning to work through complex problems, while still managing to remain fast-paced, emotionally engaging, and broadly entertaining rather than dry or overly academic in tone. He specifically credited Lord and Miller's direction for taking what could easily have been a bleak or emotionally heavy narrative, given its premise involving planetary catastrophe and a suicide mission, and instead infusing it with the same kind of buoyant energy and cheerfulness that had characterized their earlier acclaimed animated work. Barber also singled out Gosling's performance for praise, describing the actor as bringing a distinctive goofball charm to his portrayal of an amnesiac former biologist thrust into the role of humanity's last hope. Taken as a whole, the range of critical response to Project Hail Mary reveals a broadly consistent set of praised elements across even the more mixed or qualified reviews. Gosling's central performance was almost universally singled out as a major strength of the film, frequently described using words like charm, warmth, and likability. The visual craftsmanship of the production, encompassing both its digital visual effects and its more tactile practical elements, including the puppetry work behind Rocky, drew consistent admiration, and the emotional register the filmmaker struck, blending genuine stakes and scientific problem solving with an ultimately hopeful humanistic tone, resonated strongly with the majority of critics who reviewed the film, even among those like Bradshaw and Hertz, who expressed some reservations about the film's originality or occasional tonal unevenness. The relatively small number of more skeptical voices within the overall critical response tended to focus their reservations not on any single glaring flaw, but on a sense that the film, while extremely well executed, drew heavily and openly on the conventions and emotional beats of earlier beloved science fiction and family adventure films, a critique that, notably, several reviewers seem to regard as a relatively minor complaint, given how skillfully and affectionately those familiar elements were assembled into the finished work. The film's box office success, combined with this broadly positive critical reception across nearly every major review aggregation platform, and a strong A grade from opening weekend audiences polled by CinemaScore, together paint a picture of a rare alignment between commercial performance and critical esteem, an outcome that is far from guaranteed for any major studio blockbuster, let alone one built around original, non-franchise intellectual property adapted from a single, relatively recent novel, rather than an established, long-running cinematic universe or well-known pre-existing media franchise.